While Adolf Hitler led Nazi Germany with an iron grip, the women married to his top commanders lived in the shadows of absolute power. These wives were more than just silent partners. They were proud supporters, symbols of Nazi values, and often directly involved in the regime's elite social circles. But when the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, their privilege turned into punishment, and their loyalty came at a heavy price. Magda Goebbels wasn't just the wife of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda. To many inside the Nazi regime, she was seen as the perfect image of a loyal German woman, graceful, dedicated, and fully committed to Hitler's vision. She attended rallies, stood by Hitler in public, and was even close enough to call him a father figure to her children. As Nazi Germany started collapsing in April 1945, the Goebbels family didn't try to escape. While others were fleeing, Magda and Joseph moved into Hitler's underground Führerbunker in Berlin with their 6 children, aged between 4 and 12. They believed in the Nazi cause so deeply that they couldn't imagine life after its defeat. In the final days of the war, Berlin was being bombed constantly. Soviet forces were closing in fast. Inside the bunker, Hitler had already decided to end his life. On April 30th, 1945, he shot himself. The next day, May 1st, Magda carried out what many now consider one of the most disturbing acts of blind loyalty in history. She helped poison her 6 children, one by one, as they slept. Some accounts say she gave them sedatives first, then cyanide. Others say she tried to comfort them, telling them they were going to sleep. Either way, the results were the same. All 6 children were murdered by their own parents. Soon after, Magda and Joseph went up to the garden of the Reich Chancellery. There, they either swallowed cyanide or were shot, possibly both, to ensure death. Their bodies were burned, just like Hitler's had been the day before. Magda left behind letters, several of them. In them, she wrote that she didn't want her children to grow up in a world without National Socialism. She believed Germany would never recover and that their lives wouldn't be worth living after the fall of the Nazi regime. Even among the chaos of the war's end, what Magda did shocked many. Even hardened SS officers were disturbed by her choice to kill her own children rather than let them live in defeat. But Magda wasn't the only woman tied to power in the crumbling Reich. Just a few days earlier, another wife was desperately trying to escape Germany with her family. Margaret Himmler, wife of Heinrich Himmler, believed just as strongly in Nazi ideals. Born into a well-off conservative German family, Margaret was proud of her status, her country, and the future she thought the Nazis were creating. She was a trained nurse and volunteered with the German Red Cross during the war. In her letters, she often praised Hitler, admired the Nazi elite, and showed strong support for her husband's work, even though she rarely knew the full scope of it. She and Heinrich had one daughter, Gudrun, born in 1929, and Marguerite tried to raise her in a home that reflected discipline, loyalty, and strong German values. She traveled to visit soldiers, attended events with other SS families, and remained closely connected to Nazi networks throughout the war. But even though she wasn't in the inner political circle, Marguerite benefited from her husband's power, living in comfort, while millions were suffering under Nazi rule. When the war ended, everything changed. Heinrich Himmler tried to escape justice. He used a fake name, calling himself Heinrich Hitzinger, and dressed as a regular soldier, hoping to disappear into the chaos of post-war Germany. But the British caught him near Bremen, and when they figured out who he really was, Himmler swallowed a cyanide capsule and died within minutes, avoiding the courtroom that would have certainly sentenced him to death. Margaret, who had been hiding in northern Italy with their daughter, was arrested on May 13, 1945. The Allies saw her as more than just a wife. They believed that she'd played a role in promoting Nazi values and had knowingly supported one of the regime's most brutal leaders. She was held in several Allied internment camps over the next 3 years, including in Augsburg. In 1948, a denazification court in Germany finally reviewed her case. Margaret insisted that she had never been involved in politics, never truly understood her husband's work, and had simply lived as a nurse and mother. But investigators read her wartime letters and saw the signs of someone deeply tied to Nazi ideology. The court ruled her a major offender, one of the highest categories in the post-war Nazi trials. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison, minus the time she'd already spent in custody. It wasn't a long sentence compared to the crimes of her husband, but it was enough to ruin the life she once knew. After she was released, Margaret disappeared from public view. She changed her name and moved to Munich, where she lived a quiet, isolated life until her death in 1967. Her daughter Gudrun never gave up trying to clear her father's name and stayed loyal to Nazi beliefs even into adulthood. But Margaret never returned to the public stage. For some of these women, the war didn't end with a body or a trial. It ended with not knowing at all. Gerda Bormann was married to Martin Bormann, one of the most powerful and feared men in Nazi Germany. As Hitler's private secretary and right-hand man, Bormann controlled access to the Führer, signed off on deadly orders, and helped shape the policies that destroyed millions of lives. He was everywhere in Hitler's inner circle, yet he stayed mostly in the shadows. His influence was quiet, but massive. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, Bormann vanished. The last confirmed sighting of him was May 2nd, near Berlin's Lehrter station. After Hitler's suicide, Bormann tried to escape the city with other top officials. Some claimed he was killed by Soviet fire. Others said he escaped. By the time the Nuremberg trial started in 1945, no one knew where he was. Still, in 1946, he was tried in absentia and sentenced to death. But there was no body, no grave, just rumors. For Gerda Bormann, the uncertainty became a prison of its own. She didn't know if her husband was alive, hiding somewhere, or dead in a ditch. Some people whispered he had fled to South America like other Nazis. Others claimed he was living under a new identity. But Gerda refused to believe he was gone. She continued to act like he would come back someday. Meanwhile, she was left to raise their 10 children alone. The Bormann name was known around the world for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't just a last name, it was a stain. Her children struggled with it in different ways. Some distanced themselves completely. Others stayed loyal. One of her sons, Martin Bormann Jr., took a very different path. He became a Catholic priest and spent his life trying to make peace with the legacy his father left behind. In 1946, while the world debated her husband's whereabouts, Gerda fell seriously ill with cancer. She died later that year, at just 46 years old. She never got closure, she never remarried, and she never let go of her loyalty to Martin. But the mystery didn't stay open forever. In 1972, almost 30 years later, construction workers found human remains buried near Berlin's Lehrter station, right where Bormann had last been seen. DNA testing in the 1990s finally confirmed it was him. He had died in May 1945, likely by biting a cyanide capsule as Soviet troops closed in on him. By that time, Gerda was long gone. She died not knowing the truth, and her children were left to carry the burden. Some women never stopped believing. Ilse Huss was one of them. Her husband, Rudolf Huss, had once been one of the most important men in Nazi Germany. He was Hitler's deputy Führer and one of his earliest supporters. But in 1941, during the war, Huss made a strange and bold move. He flew a small plane to Scotland, completely alone. He said he wanted to talk peace with the British and stop the bloodshed. Instead, he was arrested and imprisoned by British forces. Hitler was furious and declared him insane. Huss became an embarrassment to the Nazi leadership. After the war, Rudolf was brought to the Nuremberg trials. He was found guilty of crimes against peace and conspiracy. And in 1946, he was sentenced to life in prison. He was locked away in Spandau prison in Berlin, where he stayed until his death over 40 years later. Ilse Huss, meanwhile, was arrested in 1945, just like many other women tied to the Nazi elite. She spent time in detention and was eventually labeled a lesser offender. She didn't go to prison for long, but her reputation was destroyed. She had been a part of the Nazi world from the very beginning, and even after her release, she didn't try to distance herself from it. Instead, she doubled down. For the rest of her life, Ilse campaigned to clear Rudolf's name. She believed his flight to Scotland had been an act of peace, not treason. She said he had tried to save Europe from more war, and that history had misunderstood him. She gave interviews, wrote letters, and published books, all arguing that her husband had been treated unfairly. When Rudolf Höss died in 1987, officially by suicide, though conspiracy theories still surround his death, Ilse didn't back down. She continued to defend his legacy until her own death in 1995. By then, the world had long since turned its back on everything they'd stood for, but Ilse hadn't. She never stopped believing in the cause that had torn the world apart. But not every Nazi wife stood by blindly. One woman took a different path entirely. Emily Schindler didn't fit the mold. She was married to Oskar Schindler, a Nazi Party member who used his factory to save more than 1,000 Jews. Now, while Oskar got the spotlight, Emily did a lot behind the scenes, feeding workers, hiding them from danger, putting her own life at risk. After the war, Emily and Oskar fled to Argentina, but things didn't go well. Oskar failed in business and eventually left Emily behind. She lived in poverty, raising animals to survive. And while the world celebrated Oskar, Emily was mostly forgotten. It wasn't until the 1990s that people started telling her story too. But she had already spent decades alone, poor, and quietly living in a country that didn't speak her language. She passed away in 2001, still far from the country she once called home. Emily was an exception, as some women even defended the crimes they had seen up close. Lena Heydrich was married to Reinhard Heydrich, the man who planned the final solution. He was assassinated in 1942, and Lena spent the rest of her life raising their children and protecting his legacy. After the war, she was arrested but never charged. She later moved to the island of Fehmarn and remarried. But in the 1970s, she spoke proudly of her husband, claiming he had been misunderstood. She even published a book trying to clear his name. While many saw her husband as one of the most brutal Nazis, she saw him as a strong leader. She showed no shame, no remorse. While some Nazi wives clung to their pride, others chose silence. Margaret Speer was married to Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect, and later his Minister of Armaments. He was one of the few Nazi leaders who admitted guilt at the Nuremberg trials. For that, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But Elizabeth never gave public support or criticism. She didn't attend the trial. She didn't write letters. She didn't stand by him in the newspapers. She just waited, quietly, and far away from the spotlight. When Speer was released from prison in 1966, they reunited, but the relationship had changed. He had become famous for his books and interviews, while she preferred life in the background. Elizabeth lived her days away from public life and passed away in 1980, barely mentioned in her husband's memoirs. Annie Brandt, the wife of Nazi official Rudolf Brandt, faced a much more tragic end. Her husband had worked directly with Himmler and was part of the horrifying medical experiments done on prisoners. Rudolf Brandt was arrested, tried, and executed in 1948. For Annie, everything collapsed at once. She lost her husband, her home, and any chance at a normal life. Their property was seized. She was questioned and watched for years. Her name became a permanent stain. Unlike other wives who tried to defend their husbands, Annie simply disappeared into silence. She never remarried, never gave interviews, and avoided even her own family. The shame and horror were too heavy to carry publicly. Traudl Junge wasn't a wife, but deserves a place in these stories. She was Hitler's personal secretary. In her early 20s during the war, she typed his final will in the Berlin bunker and was one of the last people to see him alive. After the war, Traudl was captured by Soviet forces and then interrogated by the Americans. She wasn't charged with any crimes, but she lived the rest of her life asking herself one question: should she have known what was happening around her? In interviews later in life, she admitted feeling guilty, not for something she did, but for not asking questions, for not seeing the truth until it was too late. Henrietta von Schirach had once been a personal friend of Hitler. Her husband, Baldur von Schirach, led the Hitler Youth and later governed Vienna. Together, they had been considered Nazi royalty, but that world ended quickly. Baldur was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Henrietta was arrested in 1945, held for months, and interrogated by Allied forces. After her release, she was declared a fellow traveler, meaning someone who wasn't an active war criminal, but had supported the regime. She divorced her husband and tried to start a new life, but the past followed her everywhere. In her later years, she wrote about how the glamour of the Nazi world had blinded her. She admitted feeling misled, but the damage was already done. Some stories are almost completely lost, like that of Ingeborg Weber Donitz, the wife of Karl Donitz. Donitz was Hitler's chosen successor, the man who led Germany for a short time after Hitler's death in 1945. He was later sentenced to 10 years in prison at Nuremberg, though his crimes were considered less severe than others. Kathy kept an extremely low profile throughout the post-war years. She rarely appeared in public, gave no interviews, and didn't comment on her husband's role. She lived quietly with her children until her death in 1962. There are very few public records about her life, no books or statements. And maybe that was the point. Fading away was sometimes safer than speaking out. For many of these women, the pain didn't end with them. Their children often grew up under a heavy shadow, haunted by the names they inherited, the crimes they never committed, and the public judgment they couldn't escape. By the 1960s and 70s, most of the Nazi leaders' wives had either passed away or disappeared into old age. Germany itself was changing. A new generation wanted answers. Young people demanded to know what their parents had done during the war. Protests broke out, books were written, trials were reopened, and slowly the stories of these women began to resurface, not as victims, but as hidden witnesses to a dark, dark past. In 1993, the release of Schindler's List reminded the world of Emily Schindler. In 2002, the documentary Blind Spot let Traudl Junge speak directly about her regrets. More books followed, more testimonies were uncovered, and the silence began to crack. The end of the war didn't just bring military defeat, it brought a collapse of identity for the wives of Nazi leaders. These women had lived at the center of one of the most powerful and dangerous regimes in history, and when it ended, they found themselves trapped between public hatred and personal loss. Some took their lives, others lost everything. A few clung to old beliefs, but none of them walked away untouched.